This is Festival Sounds. I hope you enjoyed the last episode with Roy Gurvitz. This episode is about his journey in the early days of working at Glastonbury, how he first met Michael Eavis, the dynamics of New Age travellers working at the festival, and the challenges the festival had with the police, travellers, those inside and outside the fence. If you enjoyed the episode, maybe give it a subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and then you'll know when the next episode drops.
I had other people that would go, hey, why don't we do this and do something together, and I could sell wine and they could set up a stage and play music and, actually set up a small venue.
When was this? We're talking in the 80s now.
Yeah, we're talking the 90s, I'd say, right. By now. I first went to Glastonbury in 1987, so, it would have been 88.
Was that with a massive barrel of wine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then that became several barrels of wine.
Yeah. So it clearly went down well. People wanted it.
Oh my God, yeah. So I didn't realise, but for 3 years running, I'd have these two quite elderly gentlemen, if you like, that would regularly come and attend every evening, lean on the end of my bar and demand their usual, which I had no idea. I used to just give them whatever I had most of to get rid of it.
Well, that works.
And they would sit there and drink for hours on end, and that was John Peel and Andy Kershaw.
You're kidding?
Come down, not kidding, no. And I had no idea who they were at the time because I didn't really listen to the radio, so why would I? But yeah, it was John Peel and Andy Kershaw, and so after I worked out who it was and what else sort of was going on at this Glastonbury Festival, so I would never go to the main stage, or it was just too peoply, too busy. I realised that there was, more going on, and then so then I had other friends who'd come by and say, well, let's set up a stage and we could have a tent, and so I got a tent and built a stage and put the wine bar in the tent, and and you get all these amazing musicians turning up that wanted to play, Nick Turner and dozens of other really good bands and stuff, and we'd all play, and we'd pay them some money out of the takings of the bar, and everybody earned a little bit of money.
So there's a lot to dissect here. Just paint a picture for me. Whereabouts are you in that festival, like in terms of geography?
In terms of geography, just over the railway line in a field called the Underground, right, which was one of the last sort of bits of unclaimed territory at the time, right, and no one seemed to really be in control of it. But if you were site crew, you got there early, and so you could nab a space in that field,
and that's how it worked.
And that was how it worked.
Wow.
Yeah. And obviously there was a bit of argy-bargy because as the festival got bigger, there was more site crew, so more site crew wanted to be in there. And then it kind of spread further out to the southeast corner, but then further out you went, the less mainstream punters, you wouldn't get that much of a flow of people going through. So,
were you?
It's like town planning. If you set up a cafe in the middle of town, you're going to sell quite a lot. You sell it up on the outskirts, maybe not so much. But over time, the outskirts become the trendy place, and the middle of town becomes too corporate and gets taken over by, McDonald's or Cafe Nero or whoever.
Again, I'm trying to picture it because it sounds, you've described it as organic and it just kind of happens. And how would people know you were there? Is it a case of word of mouth, or you were on some kind of map, or they'd stumble into it by accident?
I think there's a lot of stumbling. And I think, Glastonbury has always been quite big, and if you've got, 300,000 people in a field, which is at the point around that time of how big it actually got, because there was a fence, but it didn't necessarily go all the way around the festival. And when it did go all the way around the festival, some of it fell over. So there was a lot of people there. and they overspill and they wander around and try to see and find what's happening. So beyond that bit of the railway line is what's was at the time known as the green field. So there was still a lot of stuff going on. There was green car crafts and green arts. There's permaculture. There's all sorts of alternative things other than banging music going on. Yeah. Even once you're up there, having a little bit of music seemed like a good idea. So we did that. Again, got a bit of criticism because there's like people that go, well, we've set up here because we want it to be nice and peaceful. You want to play music, go and play it down there. And you're going, it's a festival. Like, do you know what I mean? The whole thing's a festival. Yeah. And, and I believe that if we had a venue and we were attracting people, then there would be more people being attracted to a craft area rather than, it's town planning, isn't it? It's all, everything kind of develops, and if you have nothing going on, no one's going to go there, then the people that are trying to sell their crafts aren't going to do very well because there's nobody there.
And nobody wants the same thing again and again, or a variation on a theme. Everything I hear about what you created in that corner is that it was very different. Did you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, it was the only thing that was designed. It was an antidote to what was going on around the time. So, I mean, what I've just been talking about with running these impromptu bars whilst working a site crew was before Lost Vagueness, and I hadn't really thought about the bigger picture. I wasn't that involved with the bigger picture, but I sort of over time became more involved with the event. So although I was working as site crew, I had a very menial job, which was mostly laying out and clearing up the posts for fire lanes. Not particularly interesting. I did do litter picking once, but I just couldn't really stand it. But that was the first time I met Mr. Evis, and I think it would have been 87. So after the festival, I went and did litter picking, and it was £10 a day. And even for £10 a day, it was really, really hard work. And I didn't think £10 a day was appropriate, for a 10-hour day. £1 an hour was like, and it was hard work. And on every evening, Michael had come round with the main person that would organise the litter picking and his main farmhand, and they'd stand behind him like colonial bodyguards. A little tent and a little fold-out campaign table, and he'd sit in a little chair, and you'd literally walk up to the desk and he'd tick your name off a list that had been usually written out by hand of a couple of hundred names, and he'd pay everybody £10. And I got there and he went, oh, hi, your new face. I went, yeah. And he went, where's your £10? And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I don't think that's acceptable. And it was like, everyone was like, what? The guy that was organising it was like, how dare you? And Michael went, no, let him speak. I said, sorry, look, it's 1987, £10 a day for what is actually really hard work. It just doesn't cut it. He says, well, what do you think would be appropriate? I said, well, I think it should be doubled to 20. The next day, everyone got paid 20 quid.
Wow.
And I think it got me noticed by Michael, even though I'd cost him double the money. It was clearly something that he could afford, and he was a Quaker, so he himself doesn't like injustice. So that was the start of my relationship with him. So later on, when I was running this bar, the bars obviously started to become an issue because of licensing, because the whole event was getting more and more contained. Fences needed to be erected, like I mentioned, and the whole event was being more controlled by the council, and obviously the festival had to comply. But there was still areas of lawlessness which were difficult for the festival to deal with. One of which was the bars, but they were being picked off one at a time. And so if any bar ever had an issue that security were called, the security would literally shut it down.
Right.
So me having the advantage of running a wine bar, I had less of those issues.
Yeah.
It's just not a very sort of fighty drink. So it just didn't really. I mean, there were issues that arose, but they were dealt with by ourselves before the security would get wind of it. So I was the last bar standing.
And you also don't strike me as a man who struggles to be direct. So if someone was out of line, I'm sure you'd very quickly tell them to behave, and I'm sure they probably behaved.
Well, we had means and ways.
Well, I'm sure.
That might be another podcast.
Yeah, that's a whole different episode, that one.
And so I became the last bar, the last free bar at Glastonbury, and then that was the sort of 90s, and at that time the festival had issue. Well, it was when was it? It was sort of mid to late 90s, where the festival was having its biggest problems. Wasn't so much the drugs, although it was related to it. It was sound systems and noise. And so it was around the time then when sort of micro systems could be set up in the boot of a Mini, or a micro car. You could have a 10k rig in the boot, and there were hundreds of these coming in.
Wow.
And so every night when the licensing said, well, the festival must go quiet at midnight or 1 o'clock on Saturday, I think was the regulation. At that point, all of these illegitimate sound systems would all just fire up all over the place, and it was uncontrollable. For a number of reasons. One, the security couldn't even work out where the sound systems were, because people were being very clever and getting there early and hiding them under a teepee or putting them up in a tree or literally just in the boot of a car with a tarp over it. And, the security were out of their depth, because the security at the time, let's face it, were just doormen that came in from the cities. And they didn't know what to do, so there wasn't even a door.
It's hard to follow your ears when everybody has a sound system as well.
That as well. And there's tens of thousands of people around every single one.
The numbers I hear.
And it's dark, and there's no lights. And
again, you've got to separate it from what people see at the festival now. A very different place. And
it was quite lawless. It appeared to be lawless.
And the volume of people was also at a different level from what I understand. The figures I've heard are, and they're estimates, but 300,000 people.
I would say 300,000 people at its peak.
And controlling that when it's not designed for that makes it even harder.
Well, it was, I think, without wanting to get political now, but I think the naivety of the licensee and the head of security was such that they thought that they could shut it down. They thought they could control it. And their angle on it was, well, we'll just tell everybody to go to bed. We'll tell all the people with tickets that they have to go to bed. And you go, the absurdity of saying that. Someone's bought a ticket for a festival, which back then I think was probably 100 or 150 quid for the weekend. The tickets for the weekend.
Yeah.
It's not from 10 o'clock in the morning till midnight. It's for the weekend. You can't tell people what time to go to bed.
They're also festival people who are not the type to want to go to bed at midnight.
They're also that. They're not, generally, back then anyway, they weren't compliant people.
Yeah.
Or they were compliant people, but they were at a festival to be non-compliant. They've gone there for a party and they want to party for the weekend. They've taken sufficient amount of drugs to keep going for the weekend. All of that is there available. If you don't want that to happen, don't sell the drugs. You know, you say, well, they're not selling it, it's the drug dealers. Yeah, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But, you know, you can't... It's a big picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you either have the whole picture coloured in or you block out bits of the picture. You can't ignore them. You know, it's a jigsaw puzzle. If you take pieces out, you can see the pieces aren't there and something else will fill that space.
Where did you fit into all of that then?
Well, because I'd started having a relationship with Michael and I would sort of solve issues for him, and particularly issues that arose with the police and the traveller scene. And what you've got to bear in mind is that all of the site crew, or maybe 90% of it at least, were travellers. And so if you don't allow any travellers on to Glastonbury Festival, you have no festival. So now there's a divide between travellers that are allowed on and travellers that aren't. And how do you work that out? You know, who makes that decision? And so the police were kind of like forcing Michael to not allow travellers on that weren't travellers in his mind. They were his site crew.
Yeah.
So there was this weird sort of thing. And then obviously there are also a lot of new age travellers turning up that are now turning up because they're not allowed to. You know, so you've got the fraternity that want to turn up and want to sell drugs at the festival and they're not being allowed to. And so they become confrontational. Because they're confrontational and the police are there, there's a confrontation. And the police are then saying to Michael, right, well, we're going to revoke your licence and shut down the festival, which is absurd because that's not really going to happen.
That volume of people on your doorstep.
But they're threatening it and, you know, trying to negotiate with Michael and making it Michael's problem to deal with. We're going, well, you know, having that conversation and then going, well, we'll just fine you. You know, we'll fine you out of existence. And your festival won't happen next year and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, Michael's sort of there scratching his head. And of course, you know, he goes out to try and talk to the people in vehicles to come in, and they're just accusing him. They see him in front of a line of police. So it's all one thing.
Yeah.
So they're being abusive to him, and he doesn't know what to do or where to turn. So he turned to me and a few other people that I know that were involved with the festival that did live in vehicles at the time. And he's like, well, not so much going, oh, help, but he's going, what do we do?
Yeah, again, the perception is that this happens in a very kind of structured way. But
No,
again,
it was chaos.
Yeah, those conversations at that time. Now it probably happens in a very structured way, but at that time, I imagine it was a friendly conversation with people he knew and had worked with previously.
It was quite chaotic, and it was happening on the hoof. It wasn't anything that had been planned, you know. So he called some of his key people that he knew that were working there, a site crew that also had a relationship with the people that were outside, going, we need to resolve this. And on one occasion, I mean, this particular one occasion, myself and a guy called Roddy and Dale Vince, who I think he's just sold it. He was the CEO of Ecotricity.
Right.
Well, now, he wasn't then. We all had tow trucks. And so Michael basically, this was... So I think some of this is in the film, or it might be in one of the other documentaries. So Michael's idea initially was, why don't we there's 30 vehicles out on the road that the police are going, if we don't get them moved and not allow them in, if we can't convince them to move, then they're going to shut the festival down. So we have to convince them to move. Michael's idea was, he came out with 2 carrier bags full of cash. He said, there's £30,000 here, and handed it to my mate Keith. And went, give them £1,000 each to make them go away.
That's an unusual approach.
But that long silence was much longer, where we all just looked at each other. And although initially that would have probably have worked, but it was like, well, what happens next? What happens after that? And the problem is that most of the site crew, which were working there for a month, were probably getting paid less than £1,000.
So you've got these new age travellers who want to be part of it, and then you've got the site crew, and the festival seem to be in the middle.
It's not that clear cut.
No, it's all a bit more homogenous.
It's all a bit blurred. But you've got this situation where he wants to give £1,000 to each of these vehicles in this long line, irregardless of how many people are in each vehicle or whatever. Let's just give them £1,000 for each vehicle. And we're like, by the time we've got to the 30th vehicle, word would have got out, and you'll have another 50 vehicles in the line. And then behind that, there'll be another 100, and half of them will be your site crew, because they'd be getting twice as much money to leave the festival than they are to stay. So that's not going to work.
How do you solve a problem like that?
Well, Michael was there with the money and giving it to Keith, and we'd had that conversation in like 30 seconds, and he'd given the money back, and Michael went back inside, and me and Keith looked at each other and went, why didn't we just take the money and leave?
Yeah.
You and me, we just had like 15 grand each. We could have just got in our vehicles and lived happily ever after.
Why didn't you?
Because I'm both of us not morally corrupt. and I think we hadn't really thought it through. That was the conversation that we had whilst he was putting the money back inside, and we had to come up with a plan to kind of resolve what was going on. So anyway, when he came back out, we said, look, why don't we find these people somewhere to go? You know, you must know other landowners in the area where they can go and, you know, spend the weekend. Maybe you can give them tickets or wristbands that they can come, you know, on foot, or, you know, in a bus. You know, we can relay them, and so they can come to the festival, but not with the vehicles, to make it look like. So yeah, so Michael agreed to all of this, and we escorted this convoy with our tow trucks in case anybody ran out. But the police didn't let them go where Michael had arranged, and the police kind of escorted this whole convoy out of the county into Dorset. Dorset escorted them back round in a big round grab out way back into Somerset, and they had a horrible weekend. Wow. And myself and Roddy escorted them for most of the time and most of the way.
So you became this kind of go-between between
a
festival and
a peacekeeper,
that part of the kind of travelling community.
So then later, I think it was either that year. I think it was later that year. Because that convoy, like I say, had been escorted to Dorset, and then that escorted out of Dorset back into Somerset. And later, in the middle of the night, they turned up at the back end of the festival, which is off the A37 in a road called Cotton Mill Lane, which is again the southeast corner, which was where I was parked up doing my thing. And
it's worth mentioning that it wasn't the southeast corner, it just happened to be the southeast corner of some fields. There was nothing there.
It was the southeast corner of the enclosure. So
there was no late night corner at that point.
Well, it kind of was, because this is when all the sound systems were still happening.
So it was the informal time.
Informal. And I just got a call in the middle of the night saying, well, not a call, someone knocked on my door. This is pre me having a mobile phone, or at least pre them anyone else having one. That was the amazing thing about having a mobile phone, is that nobody had mobile phones. So it was kind of a bit weird having a mobile phone.
Yeah,
but that's another story. And I just got a call saying, oh, we've broken down on the A37 and the police are threatening to tow us away, and we were coming here with some other vehicles. So I said okay, and I went out to tow them in. And he went, "Oh, you can't go that way because there's about 150 vehicles in front of him that had gone down this single carriage lane." So I had to go out the main site all the way round, picked him up, and then I had to literally wait behind all these other vehicles to get back in, and in front of them was the police, again saying, "No, we can't let anybody on." And then there was a steel gate, so no one could get through. But this whole road was blocked, so there was this sort of whole confrontation. And I know for a fact that Michael was just saying, "Look, just open the gates and let them in. They can park there. It's not a problem." And they were going, "No, it's a problem." And you're like, well, they can't go anywhere else now because the road's closed and they're backed up all the way to the A37. So shortly, the A37 is going to be blocked, and then it's going to be a much bigger problem. Yeah. The police wouldn't have it. They didn't. The police that were there at the gate didn't have the authority to open it. They were backed up by security. Michael went away, and about half an hour later, he This is where the story has to become a little bit covert. About half an hour later, a JCB comes through the hedge and separates the hedge and fills in the ditch and levels it out. And this is like just to the 10 yards by where the gate is. And I'm kind of there, and suddenly out of the hedge, Michael gives me some keys and says, "Yeah, they can come through here. Here's the keys if you need to make the gate a bit wider." And he disappears off into the night, and I start directing traffic in through this newly formed gate. So clearly at that point, Michael clearly wasn't all bad, but that's just one. Yeah. It's just one incident. Other times, I've when I was a little bit more established when Lost Vagueness had started happening, and the reason, going back to the impromptu raves everywhere and the security going, "We can shut it all down," they couldn't, and they tried one year, and the following year the council were going, "We can't let this event go ahead unless you can come up with an actual plan." Yeah. To control the noise, basically. It was noise complaints at that point that they were more concerned about. And so I came up with this suggestion that was pretty out there and ridiculous, going, "Well, look, clearly people want music, clearly people want to dance, people clearly want to be entertained. They've paid to have some form of entertainment for the entire time that they're there, and the security aren't able to stop that." Yeah. And he said, "Well, what would you do?" And I said, "Well, let's have an area that's in the least sound sensitive area of the festival, with sound systems that are controlled. We can control the volume, and we can control the type of music, and we can control the direction of the music, and we can control the entertainment." So, there's me being an anarchist, and I've just used the word control 4 times. So it was a bit of a paradox, but it was like a way of keeping the festival alive. So anyway, my ridiculous idea was, we'll have disco music, we'll have vintage music, we'll have wind-up gramophones, we'll have theatrical entertainment, we'll have a whole array of things that isn't banging techno.
And that was Lost Vagueness.
That was where Lost Vagueness actually started.
Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed that episode. Tomorrow we've got the final episode in this 3-part special. So that's Roy Gurvitz talking about the creation of Lost Vagueness, how he changed the appearance of people in the southeast corner to make it more welcoming, and how they created those immersive spaces, blurring the lines between art and the audience. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on Apple or Spotify. And if you really enjoy the show, maybe give us a 5-star rating.